The Hells Angels biker found the little girl forced into a van, and his strike ended a predator's hunt instantly. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's gripping tale. It was a cold, windy evening when Jake, known by his Hells Angels moniker Reaper, was cruising down a secluded stretch of road. The roar of his Harley-Davidson cut through the night air, the engine's deep growl vibrating beneath him. The roads were eerily empty, save for the occasional flickering streetlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. As Jake leaned into the curve, something caught his eye. A dark van slowly driving past, the back doors wide open. Instantly, a sense of unease washed over him, an instinct he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the van itself, but the motion of something, or someone, struggling inside, barely visible through the dim light. His sharp eyes locked onto a figure, a little girl, trapped in the back of the van, her face a mask of terror. Without thinking, Jake slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, his heart pounding as he gave chase. The van sped up, clearly trying to escape, but Jake's Harley was faster, its engine growling in response. His leather jacket whipped against his broad shoulders as he swerved to avoid the occasional pothole. The girl's muffled cries became clearer, and Jake's anger began to boil. The nerve of these predators. He wasn't going to let them get away. Just as the van made a sharp turn into an abandoned lot, Jake was right behind it, his bike skidding to a stop mere inches from the van's bumper. He leaped off the bike, eyes narrowing in fury as he saw the men inside. They had barely begun to react when Jake yanked open the van's door with force, his muscles straining under the weight of pure adrenaline. One of the men lunged at him, but Jake was quicker, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a flash of fury. The man staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief. The girl, no older than 8, was shaking uncontrollably, her arms pressed against her body in a futile attempt to protect herself. "Hey, it's okay," Jake said softly, his rough voice softer than usual as he knelt down to her level. His usual tough, intimidating persona melted away as he carefully reached out to her. "You're safe now." The girl's wide eyes locked onto his, confusion and fear slowly replaced with a fragile sense of trust. "What's your name, little one?" Jake asked, his voice gentle despite the rage bubbling inside. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her small hand trembled as she reached out to him. Just as Jake reached to help her out of the van, the other man recovered, rushing toward him with a knife in hand. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed the blade with one hand, his powerful grip causing the man to freeze. With a single motion, he disarmed him, throwing him onto the cold, dirty ground. Emily gasped, but Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "You're all right now, Emily. Let's get you out of here." He scooped her up, his protective instincts kicking in as he shielded her with his body. Before the second man could make a move, Jake was already halfway across the parking lot, heading straight for his bike. He didn't stop to look back. All that mattered now was getting the girl to safety. Emily's small arms gripped tightly around his waist as Jake mounted his Harley, revving the engine to life. They tore down the road, the roar of the bike merging with the sound of Emily's soft sobs, a mixture of fear and relief. Jake's thoughts raced. He needed to get her to a safe place, away from the predators who were clearly after her. What they didn't know was that the Hells Angels never let one of their own fall prey to such evil. Emily's life wasn't just saved by a stranger. It was saved by family, by the code that bound them together. Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened as the city lights grew closer. They had escaped, but the night was far from over. "I'm not sure how long I can keep this up," Jake thought as he drove down the empty streets, the wind biting at his face. The weight of the little girl's life rested in his hands, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a strange warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in years. Emily had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny form nestled against his leather jacket, her breathing slow and steady. He had promised to keep her safe, but the dark figures from the van were still lurking, waiting for a chance to finish what they had started. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake's mind raced with the next steps. He had to find a way to protect Emily, keep her away from the predators who were still hunting her. The sound of his motorcycle's engine drowned out his thoughts as he maneuvered through the empty roads, the streetlights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. He couldn't help but think of his own past. How many times had he been in situations like this, where he had to make choices between right and wrong, good and evil? His days as an enforcer for the Hells Angels had taught him that loyalty and strength were everything. But here he was, faced with a helpless child who needed more than just strength. She needed protection, and Jake was the only one who could provide that. The road ahead seemed endless, but Jake was determined. They needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere far from the van and its twisted occupants. The last thing Jake wanted was for Emily to see more violence, more bloodshed. He had already seen too much of that in his own life. As they approached a small, secluded cabin tucked away in the woods, Jake felt a sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The cabin had been abandoned for years, but Jake had used it as a place to lay low when things got too heated with the club. The sound of the engine sputtered as Jake slowed down and parked the bike in front of the cabin. He carefully lifted Emily off the bike, cradling her in his arms. She stirred slightly, her little hand grasping at his jacket, seeking comfort in the warmth of his presence. "You're safe now, Emily," Jake whispered as he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The cabin was cold, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. But it was shelter and, for now, that was all that mattered. Jake gently placed Emily on the couch, pulling a blanket from the nearby shelf to cover her. She sighed softly in her sleep, her face relaxed for the first time since he had found her. Jake sat across from her, his mind racing with questions. Who were those men, and why had they been after Emily? He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random kidnapping. There was something more to this story, something dark and dangerous. As he sat in the quiet cabin, the sound of his breathing the only noise in the room, Jake's thoughts kept going back to the promise he had made, to protect Emily no matter the cost. He had lived a life of violence, but now he found himself in a different role, a protector, a guardian. It was a role he never thought he would take on, but as he looked down at the peaceful expression on Emily's face, he knew it was one he was willing to play. The storm outside grew louder, the wind howling through the trees as Jake watched over Emily, his hand resting on the handle of his gun, ready for whatever came next. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he wasn't going to let any harm come to this little girl. Not while he was still breathing. "I can't shake the feeling that they're out there," Jake thought, his hand resting on the old rifle next to him as he sat in the dimly lit cabin. The storm outside had only grown worse, the wind howling through the trees, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. Inside, it was eerily quiet, save for Emily's soft breathing as she slept on the couch. The only other sound was the occasional creak of the cabin settling into the cold. Jake knew the peace wouldn't last. He had been on enough missions to know that calm was just the calm before the storm. The men who had taken Emily weren't the type to give up easily. He glanced over at the girl, her small form wrapped in the blanket, her face peaceful for the first time in hours. He wished he could promise her that everything would be okay, that she would never have to see the horrors she had already witnessed. But Jake knew better. Life wasn't that simple, and people like him didn't get to have peaceful endings. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd felt this kind of responsibility, this kind of protectiveness. He had lived a life of brutality, violence, and loyalty to the Hells Angels. But now, with Emily in his care, he was faced with a new kind of challenge, one that didn't involve fists or bloodshed. He needed to keep her safe, and that meant he would have to outthink the predators who were still hunting her. The silence of the cabin was broken by a low rumble of thunder, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the dark woods outside. Jake's instincts kicked in as he rose from the chair, his hand resting on the gun belt strapped to his waist. He moved quietly, making his way to the small window near the back door, peering out into the storm. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. But he wasn't satisfied. There was something off about the way the storm had rolled in, the way the temperature had dropped so suddenly. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't ignore the feeling that danger was drawing closer. Just as he was about to turn back inside, a flash of movement caught his eye. A dark figure, moving swiftly through the trees. Jake's hand shot to his gun, but he didn't draw it yet. He needed to know more. His training kicked in, and he crouched low, moving around the side of the cabin to get a better view. He had been in worse situations than this, but something about this one felt different. The predator was closing in. Jake waited, his breath steady, his eyes locked on the figure moving through the woods. He knew the kind of people who would come after Emily. They weren't just any criminals. They were dangerous, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. And right now, they wanted Emily. The figure was getting closer now, and Jake could see the outline of a man, tall and broad, moving with purpose. The storm was making it harder to see, but he could still make out the man's silhouette. It wasn't just one person. There were others, more figures emerging from the trees. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They had found him. They had found Emily. He turned quickly, rushing back inside to check on her. She was still asleep, but he knew he didn't have much time. He needed to act fast. He grabbed the rifle from the corner and checked the chamber. It was loaded, ready to go. As he moved back to the door, he glanced at Emily one last time. She would be safe here, he hoped, but he couldn't take any chances. With a deep breath, Jake pushed open the door, stepping into the storm with the gun held tightly in his hands. He moved quickly and quietly, using the storm to mask his movements. The men were getting closer. They wouldn't have much time. Jake had fought many battles in his life, but this was different. He wasn't fighting for himself this time. He was fighting for Emily, for her future, and there was no way he was going to let these predators take her. As he moved into position, he thought about the promise he had made. He wasn't going to let her down. Not now, not ever. I am not going to let them hurt her, Jake thought as he crouched behind a thick oak tree, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The storm was relentless, the rain pouring down in sheets, but Jake's focus remained unbroken. Emily was still in the cabin, hidden away from view, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He could hear the sounds of footsteps crunching in the wet leaves, low voices whispering, moving closer. His grip on the rifle tightened, the weight of the weapon grounding him in the present. These men, whoever they were after something much more than just a little girl. He knew how these things worked. People like this didn't just give up. If they were willing to hunt a child this hard, then there was something much darker going on. The men were almost upon him now, and Jake's senses were on full alert. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. He had been through battles before, dangerous situations where the odds were stacked against him, but this was different. This was about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. His life, his past, had been filled with violence and chaos, but Emily had shown him a side of life he had forgotten. She reminded him of the person he once was, someone who cared, someone who could still feel the weight of responsibility. That part of him had long been buried under years of fighting and living by the code of the Hells Angels. But now, as he listened to the approaching footsteps, he felt it rising up again. His duty to protect. Jake moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the wet ground as he moved to the side of the cabin, staying hidden from view. The men were closing in, but Jake was ready. He had fought many enemies in his life, but these men were different. They were no strangers to violence. They were ruthless, cold-blooded, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. He had to act quickly. He could see them now, emerging from the trees, their figures outlined by the flashes of lightning in the distance. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Jake's heart rate quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been in situations like this before. He had to be precise, calculated. No room for mistakes. He took a deep breath and stepped out of his hiding spot, the barrel of his rifle trained on the men as they approached. "I wouldn't take another step if I were you," Jake said, his voice low but firm. The men froze, their heads snapping in his direction. They hadn't seen him coming. "You're not getting past me," Jake continued, his grip steady on the rifle. He wasn't sure how many there were, but it didn't matter. He wasn't going to let them harm Emily. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his face, sneered at him. "You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, biker," the man growled, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his waist. Jake didn't flinch. He had been in countless confrontations over the years, but this felt different. The man wasn't just a thug. He was a predator, and Jake knew that predators didn't play by the same rules. The man took a step forward, but before he could make another move, Jake fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the woods, and the men hesitated. Looking around, unsure of what to do next, Jake took advantage of their momentary confusion. He moved quickly, closing the distance between him and the man with the knife. With a swift motion, Jake knocked the knife out of the man's hand, sending it clattering to the ground. The man stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. "Not today," Jake muttered under his breath. He was done playing games. The other men began to advance, but Jake was ready. He was faster, stronger, and he knew exactly how to handle situations like this. As one of the men lunged at him, Jake sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The man let out a yelp of pain, but Jake didn't stop. He shoved the man to the ground, using the force of his body to keep him there. The remaining men hesitated, fear creeping into their eyes. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone who wouldn't back down. Jake's pulse was steady, his mind clear. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he didn't let it show. These men might have thought they were in control, but they were wrong. The only thing they controlled was their own fate. "I told you to stay away," Jake said, his voice cold, but his eyes never leaving the group. The leader, still reeling from the shock of the gunshot, stepped back, signaling for the others to retreat. They weren't stupid. They knew when they had lost. Jake watched them disappear into the woods, their footsteps fading into the storm. He didn't move until he was sure they were gone. Only then did he lower his rifle and take a deep breath. He had done it. He had kept Emily safe, at least for now. But the battle wasn't over. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, Jake felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Emily was still asleep, still safe for the moment. And that was all that mattered. "I'm not letting my guard down just yet," Jake thought as he stood near the window of the cabin, watching the storm continue to rage outside. The cold wind howled through the trees, but his focus remained sharp. He had managed to keep Emily safe so far, but something told him the worst was far from over. The men from earlier were gone for now, but they were not the only threat in these woods. The feeling of being watched had never left him, even as he tried to reassure himself that Emily was safe. She was asleep on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her small form a reminder of the responsibility he had taken on. Jake knew this was no longer just about surviving for himself. It was about protecting Emily from whatever dangers lay ahead. The first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting a pale glow across the cabin. Jake could barely make out the outline of the trees through the rain-soaked window. Everything felt still, but Jake knew better. His instincts were on high alert, and he trusted them more than anything. He grabbed his jacket from the chair and walked over to Emily, making sure she was still asleep. She looked peaceful, her breathing slow and steady. Her tiny face was relaxed for the first time since he had found her, and it brought a sense of calm to Jake. But that calm was fleeting. As he stepped outside, the wind hit him like a wave of cold steel, and his senses sharpened once again. The sound of distant engines caught his ear. Not just one engine, multiple. Biker engines. He could tell by the rumble. His pulse quickened as the realization hit him. They were back. The men who had been after Emily had returned, and this time they were bringing reinforcements. Jake's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had been through worse. He had survived situations where the odds were stacked against him. But this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. He had to protect Emily. The engines grew louder, the sound growing closer by the second. Jake quickly moved to the back of the cabin, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. His eyes locked onto the path that led toward the main road. A small group of bikers was making their way through the forest, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the storm. Jake's mind raced. He had no time to waste. He needed to move Emily. He couldn't risk her being caught in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. He grabbed the rifle from the corner of the room, checking it quickly before heading back inside. Emily was still asleep, unaware of the danger that was closing in. Jake's heart ached as he looked at her. She deserved a life without fear, without predators chasing her. But that wasn't the world she lived in. He was going to do everything in his power to make sure she survived this. Jake moved quickly, preparing to leave the cabin. He had a plan, and it didn't involve waiting for the bikers to reach him. He wasn't going to let them find him. He wasn't going to let them find Emily. As he stepped outside, the wind hit him again, colder this time, the rain falling in sheets. His eyes stayed focused on the group of bikers now visible at the edge of the forest. They were still too far to be a threat, but Jake knew that could change in an instant. He needed to be ahead of them. He needed to get Emily to safety before they had the chance to catch up. His steps were quick, measured, and he moved through the woods like a shadow, avoiding any noise that might give away his position. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady. The further he got from the cabin, the more the weight of his task pressed down on him. He had no idea how far they would chase him, but he couldn't afford to look back. Emily's safety was all that mattered now. The trail grew more difficult to navigate as the rain turned the ground into a slippery mess, but Jake didn't falter. His training had prepared him for situations like this. He had been in enough life-or-death chases to know how to stay ahead of the threat. But this time, there was more at stake than just his own life. As he pressed on, the sound of the bikers' engines grew louder. He had to act fast. He couldn't let them get any closer. The path ahead twisted and turned, the forest seeming to close in around him as he pushed forward. Emily had to be kept safe. There was no other option. Just as Jake reached a clearing, he saw them. The group of bikers, their motorcycles roaring through the trees. They were getting closer. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had to make his move now. Without hesitation, he turned and sprinted toward a nearby ridge, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. The sound of the bikers' engines faded as he ran, but he could still hear the distant rumble. He didn't have much time. Reaching the ridge, Jake glanced down at the dense woods below. This was his best shot. The drop was steep, but if he could make it, he could lead them in the wrong direction. He glanced at Emily, still nestled under the blanket in the cabin, and whispered a silent promise. He wouldn't let them find her. Not now, not ever. I've lost track of time, Jake thought as he crouched low against the rocky outcrop, the weight of Emily's safety still hanging heavily on his mind. His muscles ached from running through the dense forest, his hands slick with the cold rain, but he couldn't afford to stop. They were close now. He could hear the rumble of the motorcycles echoing through the woods, each passing second bringing the group of bikers closer. There was no more room for mistakes. Emily needed to be safe, and Jake wasn't going to let anyone harm her. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. The clearing was still a good distance away, but the ridge offered a perfect view of the path the bikers were following. They had no idea where he had gone. Jake had made sure of that. He had moved fast, taking the trail that led him through thick trees and rocky terrain, avoiding any signs that might give away his position. The bikers would be distracted by the confusion. They would be looking for him, not for the small, vulnerable girl he was protecting. That was his advantage. With every passing moment, he felt the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. Protecting Emily had given him a reason to fight, a reason to stand against the darkness that had consumed his life for so long. And now, he had to make sure she never had to face that darkness again. The engine noise grew louder, and Jake crouched lower, adjusting his position to keep out of sight. His eyes narrowed as the bikers emerged from the tree line, their silhouettes sharp against the stormy backdrop. He counted 5 of them, all heavily armed and looking as dangerous as ever. But Jake wasn't scared. He knew how to handle men like these. He had spent years fighting alongside people just like them, and now it was his turn to make sure they didn't hurt anyone else. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, his fingers tight around the cold metal. He was ready. The lead biker, a tall man with a patch over one eye, barked orders to the others as they spread out, clearly searching for him. They didn't know where he was. They didn't know how fast he could move when it mattered. Jake's heart pounded, but his breathing remained steady. He had to wait. He couldn't reveal himself yet. The element of surprise was the only thing in his favor. He needed to wait until they were in the perfect position. The bikers were getting closer now, their boots crunching against the wet ground, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Jake could hear them muttering to each other, but none of them had spotted him yet. He waited, his body tense, muscles coiled, and ready to spring into action. He watched as the lead biker moved toward the edge of the clearing, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. Jake's pulse quickened. This was it. He had no choice now. He wasn't going to let them get any closer to Emily. He stood up, moving swiftly and silently as he emerged from the cover of the trees. The bikers didn't hear him approach, their attention focused entirely on the woods around them. In a flash, Jake's rifle came up, and he fired a single shot into the air, the loud crack of the bullet ringing out through the clearing. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. "You're not going anywhere," Jake called out, his voice low but commanding. The lead biker reached for his knife, but Jake was already moving. He closed the distance between them in seconds, tackling the man to the ground with a force that sent him sprawling. The others rushed to react, but Jake was faster. He disarmed one of them with a swift strike, knocking the knife from his hand before slamming him into a nearby tree. The third man tried to make a run for it, but Jake grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the ground with a grunt. Two more bikers remained, but they hesitated, unsure of how to approach the situation. They had underestimated Jake, and now they were paying the price. He moved quickly, dispatching one with a solid punch to the jaw that knocked him out cold. The remaining biker reached for his gun, but Jake was already there, disarming him and twisting his arm behind his back. "This is over," Jake said, his voice cold as he applied pressure. The man struggled but quickly realized he was no match for Jake's strength. "You're going to stay out of our way from now on," Jake added, pushing him to the ground before stepping back. The last of the bikers scrambled to get up, but Jake didn't need to finish them off. The fight was over. The bikers were no longer a threat. He turned his attention back to the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily was still there, still waiting for him to keep her safe. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The storm raged on, but for Jake, it was as if the world had gone still. He had done what he needed to do, and now, it was time to take Emily and leave. The only question was where to go next. "I have to get her out of here," Jake thought as he stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the remnants of the biker group sprawled across the forest floor. His heart was still racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he caught his breath. The fight was over, but the reality was just beginning to settle in. He couldn't afford to waste time. Emily needed to be moved, and he needed to make sure they wouldn't come back. He turned, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the cabin was still intact. There was no sign of the other bikers, but that didn't mean they were safe yet. The storm was still relentless, the rain pouring down in sheets, but Jake didn't care about the weather anymore. His mind was on one thing, and one thing only, getting Emily to safety. She deserved a chance at a normal life, one free from fear. She deserved to forget everything that had happened to her. Jake moved quickly, heading back toward the cabin with the rifle in hand. His mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, listening for any sign of movement inside. He couldn't afford to be reckless. His instincts told him that the danger wasn't over, even though the bikers had been taken care of for now. He stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin greeting him as the door creaked open. Emily was still asleep on the couch, her small frame curled up under the blanket. Her breathing was steady, her face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. Seeing her like this gave Jake a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't risk the bikers coming back or someone else tracking them down. He had to keep moving. The noise from the storm outside grew louder as he walked over to Emily, gently shaking her awake. Her brown eyes fluttered open, a flicker of confusion crossing her face before she looked up at him. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice soft and fragile. "We have to go, Emily," Jake said, his voice firm but gentle. "We can't stay here any longer. I'll protect you, but we need to move quickly." Emily nodded slowly, her fear still evident in her eyes, but there was a trust there too. Jake had kept his word so far, and she had no reason not to believe him now. He helped her up, wrapping her in the blanket once again before picking her up in his arms. She clung to him, her tiny hands gripping his jacket tightly as they made their way toward the back door. The rain had slowed a little, but the wind was still fierce, howling through the trees. Jake's eyes scanned the woods as they stepped outside, looking for any sign of danger. He knew they wouldn't have much time before someone else came looking for them. He had to get them out of there. He moved through the woods quickly, using the storm as cover. The darkness of the night worked to their advantage, and he kept Emily close, protecting her from the cold as much as possible. His mind raced with possibilities. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. They had to find a permanent solution, a place where Emily would be safe from whoever was chasing her. But that was a problem for later. Right now he had to make sure they didn't get caught. As they reached a small clearing, Jake froze, hearing the unmistakable sound of engines in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. The bikers weren't far behind. They must have regrouped. Jake moved faster, picking up the pace as he pushed through the thick brush, his legs burning with each step. Emily's small body weighed heavily in his arms, but he didn't slow down. He had no choice. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, their engines roaring through the storm, but Jake wasn't going to let them catch up. They couldn't afford to be found. He pushed forward, heading deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning for any signs of shelter. A small cabin, an abandoned barn, anything that could keep them hidden. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the ground slippery and difficult to navigate, but Jake's resolve remained unshaken. He had to protect Emily. She had already been through too much, and now it was his turn to make sure nothing else happened to her. The woods stretched out before them, dark and foreboding, but Jake kept his focus ahead. There was no turning back. They had to keep moving. As they reached the edge of a small hill, Jake spotted a structure in the distance. A barn, old and dilapidated, but it could provide the shelter they needed. He pushed forward, his legs aching with each step. The bikers were getting closer now, the roar of their engines unmistakable, but Jake's determination only grew stronger. This wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure Emily had a chance at a life that was free from fear, free from those who would harm her. As they neared the barn, Jake could feel the pressure mounting. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. They had to make it. They had to stay ahead of the threat. With one final burst of energy, Jake reached the barn, ducking inside with Emily still clutched tightly in his arms. The door creaked closed behind them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake allowed himself to exhale. They had made it. For now. I am not safe here, Jake thought as he carefully looked around the barn, his heart still pounding from the wild sprint through the storm. Emily was still clutched tightly in his arms, her small form shaking from the cold and the fear that had never quite left her. The barn, with its dilapidated wood and rotting beams, didn't offer much protection, but it was all they had for now. He could hear the motorcycles in the distance, their engines still roaring through the rain-soaked woods. He had no doubt that the bikers were still hunting for them. They weren't the kind to give up easily. Jake set Emily down gently on the old hay-strewn floor and quickly moved to the corner of the barn. He needed to make sure they were safe. He could hear the rain slamming against the roof, the wind howling outside, but inside, the silence was thick, almost suffocating. He stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain from his body, allowing himself to finally catch his breath. But it didn't last. He had no time for rest. The bikers were getting closer, and he couldn't risk Emily being caught in the crossfire. She had already been through enough. Jake looked down at her, her brown eyes still wide with fear, but there was something else there now, trust. She trusted him, and that made his resolve even stronger. He couldn't fail her. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, closer. Jake's pulse quickened. He moved toward the barn door, peeking out through the cracks. He couldn't see much in the heavy rain, but the thundering engines told him they were almost there. He needed a plan. His mind raced as he considered their options. They couldn't stay in the barn much longer. The bikers would find them eventually, and if they did, there would be nowhere to hide. Jake cursed under his breath. There had to be a way out. He looked back at Emily, who was still sitting on the hay, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face pale with fear. He knew he couldn't just run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the bikers, and Jake wasn't sure how much longer he could protect Emily if it came to that. The only thing he knew for sure was that he wasn't going to let these men hurt her. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. He scanned the barn, his eyes flicking over the old farming tools, the broken crates, and the forgotten equipment that lay scattered around. It wasn't much, but he could use it. He had to. Jake grabbed a rusty shovel from the corner, the weight of it familiar in his hands. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He looked back at Emily. "Stay low and stay quiet," he whispered to her. She nodded, though her eyes were still filled with fear. Jake's heart broke for her, but he couldn't show it. He had to stay strong for her. He had to make sure she got out of this alive. With a deep breath, Jake stepped toward the barn door, opening it just a crack to listen for any signs of the bikers' approach. He could hear their engines now, the growl of their bikes cutting through the storm like a predator's growl. They were close. Too close. Jake quickly closed the door again, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun them on foot. Their only option now was to make a stand. Jake's heart pounded as he thought about the bikers, how they had been so sure of themselves earlier. They hadn't expected him to fight back, to take down their comrades one by one. But now, Jake was no longer just trying to survive. Now, he was fighting for Emily's life. There was no going back. The barn was small, but it could be used to his advantage. He had the upper hand in the darkness. They wouldn't be able to see him coming. He moved toward Emily, crouching down to her level. Listen, I need you to stay hidden. If anything happens to me, you run, okay? Emily's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded. I'm not going to let them hurt you, Jake said, his voice low and steady. He pulled her close for a moment, his arms wrapped tightly around her. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he couldn't give up. Not now. I'll protect you, he whispered. With that, he stood up, his muscles tense, his grip tight around the shovel. He moved toward the back of the barn, where the shadows were thick, ready to fight. The engines roared outside, and Jake knew it was time. The bikers were here. The barn doors flew open with a sudden crash, and the bikers stormed in, their faces obscured by the storm. Jake gritted his teeth, ready to face them head-on. The first biker came through the door, his knife glinting in the low light. Jake didn't hesitate. He swung the shovel, the metal end hitting the biker square in the chest. The man went down hard, gasping for air as he crumpled to the ground. Jake barely had time to react before another biker lunged at him. He ducked, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. With a quick move, Jake slammed the biker's head into the barn wall, knocking him out cold. He barely had time to catch his breath when the third biker appeared, his gun aimed straight at Jake. Jake dove for cover, rolling behind a stack of hay bales. The shot rang out, but it missed. Jake moved fast, grabbing a nearby pitchfork and launching himself at the man with the gun. The fight was chaotic, fast, and brutal. Jake was faster, stronger, and more experienced. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. With one final strike, the last biker was down, the fight over. Jake stood up, breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. He looked over at Emily, who was still hidden behind the hay bales, her eyes wide with fear. She was safe. For now. I can't believe this is happening, Jake thought as he looked down at the fallen bikers, his body still tense from the fight. The storm had let up slightly, the rain now only a gentle drizzle, but his mind was racing. He could still hear the distant growl of motorcycle engines, but for now, it seemed like the danger had passed. His eyes moved to Emily, who was still hidden behind the hay bales, her wide eyes peering at him with a mix of fear and awe. The silence in the barn was almost suffocating, broken only by the soft sound of Emily's breathing. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the reality of what had just happened starting to set in. They had survived. For now. But he knew this wasn't over. The bikers wouldn't give up that easily. The group that had come after Emily was ruthless, and there were still more out there who might come looking for her. Jake turned back to the unconscious bikers, his mind working quickly. He needed to make sure they stayed down, and he needed to find a way to get Emily out of here without being caught. He didn't have much time. He moved quickly, checking the bikers' pockets for any identification or weapons that might give him a clue about who they were working for. There were no names, but there were plenty of weapons, knives, guns, and other tools of the trade that told Jake everything he needed to know. These weren't just regular criminals. These were professionals. They were part of something much bigger than a random kidnapping. But who were they working for? And why had they targeted Emily? His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice. Jake! Emily whispered, her small figure standing behind the hay bales, still wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her eyes were filled with concern, and Jake could see the exhaustion in her face. She had been through so much already, and now, it was his turn to make sure she was safe. He moved toward her, offering her a small smile. It's okay, Emily, he said softly. You're safe. I won't let them hurt you. She nodded, though her fear hadn't fully faded. Are they gone? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced back at the bikers, still lying motionless on the floor. For now, he said, trying to sound reassuring. But we need to move. We can't stay here. They'll be back soon. Emily looked around the barn, her small hands gripping the blanket tighter. Where will we go? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake's heart ached for her. She was just a child, and yet, She had already been through more than anyone should ever experience. But Jake couldn't let himself show any weakness. He had made a promise to protect her, and he wasn't going to break it. "I'll figure it out," he said firmly. "We'll find somewhere safe." He stood up, glancing around the barn one last time before moving toward the door. His eyes scanned the area outside, searching for any signs of danger. The coast was clear for now, but Jake knew that wouldn't last long. He needed to get Emily out of there and find a more secure place to hide. He opened the barn door slowly, making sure no noise gave away their position. The air outside was cool and fresh, a welcome change from the stuffy barn. He helped Emily out, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods for any signs of movement. They moved quickly, staying low to the ground, Jake always keeping one eye on Emily to make sure she was safe. As they made their way through the woods, Jake's mind raced. Where could they go? He had no idea how long they could keep running, but he knew they couldn't afford to stop until they were completely out of danger. After what felt like hours, Jake spotted a small cabin in the distance. It was old, overgrown with vines, and clearly abandoned, but it would have to do. "We'll go there," Jake said, nodding toward the cabin. Emily looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice small. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "For now it is," he said. "I promise." As they approached the cabin, Jake's heart pounded. He didn't know what awaited them inside, but he knew they couldn't afford to turn back. They needed a place to rest, and they needed it now. The cabin was dark and cold, the wooden door creaking as Jake pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled musty, but it was better than being out in the open. Jake quickly locked the door behind them, then moved toward the corner, checking the room for any signs of danger. Satisfied that it was empty, he turned back to Emily. "Stay here," he said softly. "I'll make sure we're safe." Emily nodded, her tired eyes drooping as she sat down on the floor. Jake grabbed a nearby blanket and wrapped it around her, offering what little comfort he could. As he sat down next to her, he glanced out the window, the storm still raging outside. He wasn't sure how long they could stay in this cabin, but for now, it was their only option. The silence between them was heavy, both of them lost in their thoughts. Jake knew that they had to keep moving, but right now, they needed rest. The fight wasn't over. The bikers would be back, and Jake wasn't about to let them get Emily. Not while he was still breathing. "I can't keep running forever," Jake thought as he sat against the wall of the abandoned cabin, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like an anchor. The storm outside had softened into a light drizzle, but Jake's mind was still heavy with the reality of their circumstances. Emily was safe for now, curled up under a blanket in the corner, but Jake knew that peace would not last. The bikers weren't just going to disappear, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. The cabin was small and dark, with only a few beams of weak sunlight filtering through the cracked windows. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Emily had fallen asleep again, her breathing steady, but Jake could see the exhaustion on her face. She had been through so much already, and now it was his job to make sure she didn't have to face any more. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. He needed to get Emily somewhere safe, somewhere they wouldn't be found. The road ahead was unclear, but Jake knew he couldn't keep running for long. They needed a plan. He stood up slowly, careful not to disturb Emily, and moved to the window. His eyes scanned the woods outside, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the ground slick with rain, but there was no sign of the bikers. For now, they were safe. But Jake wasn't fooled. He knew better than to think they had gotten away unscathed. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It had been like this ever since he had taken Emily under his protection, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting danger to strike at any moment. But he couldn't afford to let fear control him. Not now. Emily needed him to be strong. He turned away from the window and moved back to where she was lying. He knelt beside her, watching her for a moment, the soft rise and fall of her chest calming him for the briefest of seconds. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her. She had been so brave through all of this, despite the horrors she had faced. She wasn't just a frightened little girl anymore. She was a survivor. Jake reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his heart aching. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He promised her that he would protect her, and he was damn well going to keep that promise. He had lived a life of violence, of loyalty to the Hells Angels. But nothing in that life had prepared him for the responsibility of protecting a child. He had always been good at taking care of himself, at surviving on his own. But now, everything was different. He couldn't do this alone. And he couldn't keep running from the past. Jake needed to find answers. Who were these people after Emily? Why was she being targeted? He knew he wasn't going to get those answers sitting in this cabin. He had to act. He had to find out what was going on, even if it meant going deeper into the danger. He stood up again, this time with purpose, his gaze locking onto the door of the cabin. He wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for the bikers to show up. It was time to take control of the situation. He quietly moved toward the door, glancing back at Emily one last time to make sure she was still safe. She was, but Jake knew the moment would come when they couldn't hide anymore. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The cool air hit him, the faint smell of rain mixing with the earth and pine of the forest. He stepped outside, the damp ground squelching beneath his boots. The woods stretched out before him, a maze of trees and underbrush. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to start somewhere. Emily was counting on him. He couldn't afford to fail her. As he moved deeper into the woods, Jake kept his senses sharp. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had him on high alert. He knew the bikers were still out there, and they weren't going to stop looking for Emily. But Jake had a plan now. He needed to find someone who could help. He wasn't about to take this on alone. There had to be someone out there who could offer some answers, someone who could help him figure out why Emily was being hunted. His mind wandered to his old contacts, the people he had worked with in the past. But could he trust any of them? The Hells Angels weren't exactly known for their willingness to help outsiders, and Jake wasn't sure if anyone would want to get involved in this. But he had no choice. Emily's life was at stake, and Jake would do whatever it took to protect her. As he moved through the woods, he thought about the future. How long could they keep running? And when would the past finally catch up with them? He couldn't answer those questions, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop fighting for Emily's safety. She deserved a future free from fear, and Jake was going to make sure she got it. He reached a small clearing, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. He didn't know if it was his imagination or if it was something else, but he felt a shift in the air. It was as if someone was watching him. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, ready to fight if necessary. But as he turned, there was nothing, just the trees and the silence of the forest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that danger was closing in. But for now, it was just him and Emily against the world. I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched, Jake thought as he moved through the thick forest, Emily's small figure close behind him. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something unspoken. The storm had eased, but Jake couldn't shake the anxiety crawling under his skin. He had been on the run before, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about Emily. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to let her down. They had found temporary refuge in the abandoned barn, but Jake knew they couldn't stay there for long. They needed to find a more permanent solution, somewhere they could be safe. The bikers hadn't given up. Jake was sure of it. He had fought hard to get Emily away from them, but he knew that they wouldn't stop hunting her until they had what they wanted. And right now, it felt like the whole world was closing in on them. Emily's small hand tugged at his sleeve, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at her, her wide eyes filled with fear. She was still a child, and yet she had already seen things no one her age should have to. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where are we going?" Jake knelt down in front of her, brushing the damp hair from her face. "We're going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed the words himself. "We just need to keep moving." Emily nodded, though Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She had already been through so much, and now, they were both caught in a storm they couldn't control. But Jake wasn't about to give up. Not on her. Not now. He stood up and motioned for her to follow him. The forest was dark, the shadows deepening as they ventured further away from the barn. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt like a threat, every rustle of leaves a warning. Jake's senses were heightened, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. They had to keep moving. As they moved deeper into the woods, Jake's mind raced. The bikers were still out there, and they were closing in. Jake had fought them off once, but he knew they would be back. The question was when. He didn't have an answer, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. The farther they got from the barn, the more exposed they became. Jake had no idea where they were going, but he knew they had to find shelter. His eyes darted around, looking for anything that could provide some kind of protection. There was nothing but trees and darkness. He needed to think fast. Just then, he heard the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. The bikers were close. Too close. He glanced down at Emily, who was holding onto his sleeve, her face pale with fear. Jake's mind raced. He had to act. They couldn't outrun the bikers. But maybe they didn't have to. Jake grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her off the path, guiding her through the thick underbrush. They moved quickly, silently, with Jake leading the way. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer, but Jake didn't slow down. He knew they had to get off the trail, get hidden. He had been in situations like this before, and the best thing he could do now was to disappear into the forest, to become a shadow. As they moved deeper into the woods, the engine noise grew louder still, but it was coming from all around them now. Jake's heart raced. They had to be careful. They had to stay hidden. Just as the bikers rounded a bend in the path, Jake pulled Emily down to the ground. His body pressed against hers as they hid behind a large tree. The bikers rode past them, their figures barely visible in the fading light. Jake held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. If they were spotted now, there would be no way out. But luck was on their side. The bikers passed without noticing them, their engines fading into the distance. Jake let out a long, quiet breath, his muscles relaxing just a little. They were safe. For now. He pulled Emily close, whispering softly, "We have to keep moving. Just a little further." She nodded silently, clutching his hand tightly. Jake knew that they couldn't stay where they were. The bikers would come back, and next time, they might not be so lucky. He needed to get them both to safety, and fast. He stood up, pulling Emily to her feet. They moved quickly and quietly, staying close to the trees and out of sight. The storm had passed, but the cold was still biting, the air damp and heavy with the scent of wet earth. It felt like the world was holding its breath, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking, waiting for them to slip up. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. They walked for what felt like hours, the woods growing darker with each passing minute. The silence around them was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. Jake was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion settle in, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. He had to find somewhere safe for Emily. As they approached a clearing, Jake's eyes scanned the area. In the distance, he saw the faint outline of a building. A house. A cabin. Whatever it was their best shot. "This way," Jake said, pulling Emily toward the clearing. He couldn't see clearly, but the building looked abandoned, and they needed shelter. He wasn't sure if they were still being followed, but he knew they couldn't afford to take any chances. As they got closer, the building came into view. It was a small, run-down cabin, the windows dark and empty. But it was better than nothing. Jake moved quickly, checking the door before opening it. It creaked as it swung open, the sound echoing in the quiet night. He stepped inside, pulling Emily in after him. The cabin was cold and musty, but it would have to do. They were safe, for now. "I can't believe we made it," Jake thought as he closed the cabin door behind them. The sound of the wind howling outside still ringing in his ears. They were safe, for now. The cabin wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a temporary refuge from the chaos they had been running from for what felt like forever. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air, the faint light from a broken window casting long shadows across the floor. Jake sat down on an old chair, his body aching from the constant running, the constant fear. His hand instinctively went to the back of his neck, rubbing at the tension that had built there over the past few days. His mind raced, still processing everything that had happened. The bikers were relentless, and he knew they would be back. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and he was sure Emily was the key. But Jake wasn't about to let that happen. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Not after everything she had already been through. His eyes shifted to Emily, still sitting quietly in the corner of the cabin. She was clutching the blanket tightly around her, her eyes wide and uncertain. She had been so brave, but Jake could see the fear still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He needed to protect her, keep her safe from the people who would tear her apart if given the chance. "Hey," Jake said softly, his voice gruff from the tension. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his. "We're safe for now," he reassured her. "You can rest." Emily nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She still had that look in her eyes, the same one that had been there when he first found her. The look of someone who had seen too much, someone who wasn't sure if safety was even possible anymore. "Will they come after us again?" Emily asked, her voice small. Jake's heart tightened at the question. He didn't want to lie to her. "They'll try," he said quietly. "But I won't let them get to you." Emily nodded again, though she still seemed uncertain. She shifted on the floor, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Jake stood up and walked over to the window, peering out at the empty landscape beyond. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still dark, the clouds swirling ominously. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had to move quickly. This cabin wasn't safe for long. Jake had never been one to sit still. He had spent years on the move, running from his past, and now, with Emily, it felt like he was running towards something he hadn't quite figured out yet. But one thing was clear, he couldn't keep running forever. They needed a place to hide, a place that no one would think to look. He turned back to Emily, who was still curled up on the floor, her eyes now closed in an attempt to sleep. He hated seeing her like this, so fragile, so vulnerable. But he knew she was stronger than she appeared. She had survived everything the world had thrown at her so far, and she wasn't about to give up now. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a distant rumble of engines. His heart skipped a beat. The bikers. They were getting closer. He quickly moved toward the door, glancing back at Emily. "Stay here," he said urgently, his voice low. "I'll be back in a minute." Emily looked up at him, her face pale. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to tell her too much, didn't want to worry her more than she already was. "I'm going to make sure we're safe," he said simply. "Just stay here and don't make a sound." He pulled the door open slowly, slipping out into the woods beyond. The engines were louder now, the sound growing closer. Jake's heart raced. He had to find a way to keep them off their trail, to make sure the bikers didn't know they were here. He moved quickly, his footsteps silent on the damp ground as he crouched low behind a tree, scanning the area. The sound of the engines was now unmistakable. The bikers were only a few hundred yards away. Jake gripped the rifle at his side, his fingers itching to act. But he couldn't make his move yet. He needed to wait for the right moment. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of gasoline and leather with it. Jake's senses were heightened. He was close. He could hear the men talking now, their voices low and muffled by the storm. They were searching for him, searching for Emily. Jake's grip tightened on the rifle as he steadied his breath. The time had come. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to take the bikers down, one by one, before they had a chance to find Emily. With a swift motion, he stepped out from behind the tree, his rifle raised and ready. The bikers were spread out now, moving cautiously through the forest, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Jake didn't hesitate. He aimed and fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the woods. The first biker fell instantly, his body crumpling to the ground. The others froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Jake quickly moved to a new position, making sure they couldn't pinpoint his location. The remaining bikers started to scatter, moving in different directions as they searched for him. But Jake was already one step ahead. He had them right where he wanted them. One by one, he picked them off, his aim precise and deadly. It didn't take long for the forest to grow quiet again, the sounds of the bikers' engines replaced by the faint rustle of leaves. Jake stood still for a moment, listening for any signs of movement. When he was sure they were all down, he turned and headed back toward the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had protected Emily. For now. "I thought we were done running," Jake thought as he sat in the small, dimly lit room of the safe house, looking over at Emily, who was quietly sitting on the old couch, her face hidden behind her long hair. The past few days had been a whirlwind of danger and survival, but now that they were in a temporary safe place, Jake's mind was still spinning with what came next. He hadn't realized just how much of a toll the constant chase had taken on him until now. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside his mind hadn't. Emily deserved peace. She deserved to sleep through the night without fearing the next knock at the door or the sound of distant engines. She had been through more than any child should have to endure, and yet, here she was, still breathing, still trusting, still holding on. Jake ran a hand through his hair, the rough, grizzled look on his face softening as he watched her. He couldn't believe how much this little girl had changed him. His life had always been about survival, about getting through each day in the dangerous world he had lived in. But with Emily, it had become about something else. It had become about something worth fighting for. He had known the Hell's Angels code, the loyalty, the brotherhood, but he had never known what it meant to truly protect someone, to fight not for glory, but for their future. As the thought lingered, a knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. His instincts kicked in, his body tensing, hand reaching for the gun he kept nearby. Who is it now? Another threat? But before he could move, the door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped inside. Jake's muscles relaxed as he recognized the visitor. Someone from his past, someone he trusted. "Jake," the man said, his voice low but steady. "It's clear. They won't be coming for you anymore." Jake stood, his eyes narrowing. He had been prepared for this moment, but hearing it confirmed didn't bring him peace. "How do you know?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. The man sighed, walking into the room and closing the door behind him. "We've made sure they know they've crossed the line. We've been watching, keeping track. They're not coming back." Jake glanced at Emily, who was still sitting on the couch, her eyes wide, sensing the change in the atmosphere. "Are you sure?" Jake pressed, his hand still lingering near his sidearm. The man nodded. "Positive. They've been taken care of. You're both safe. For now." Jake studied the man's face, searching for any hint of a lie. There was none. He had known this man for years, worked with him on countless jobs, and while their paths had parted some time ago, this man was as good as his word. Still, Jake wasn't sure he could let his guard down. "What happens next?" Jake asked, his eyes darting back to the window, checking for any sign of movement outside. The man paused before answering. "You need to get out of here, Jake. Start fresh. You're not safe in one place for long. They know you've taken her, and you need to go somewhere where no one can find you." Jake clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. He had known this was coming, but he wasn't ready to leave. "And Emily?" he asked, turning to look at her. "What about her future?" The man's expression softened as he glanced at the little girl. "She'll be fine, Jake. But you need to get her out of here. You both need a life that's free from this chaos. It's the only way to protect her." Jake stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink in. Emily was just a child. She had already lost so much, and now, the thought of taking her away from everything she knew, it felt wrong. But Jake knew that he had no other choice. They couldn't stay here. The bikers were a constant threat, and he wasn't willing to risk Emily's life any longer. The decision had already been made. It had to be. "All right," Jake finally said, his voice firm. "We'll leave." The man nodded. "Good. I'll help you get set up. But it has to be soon. The longer you stay, the more likely it is that someone will find you." Jake turned to Emily, who was now standing up, her wide eyes looking from him to the man in the doorway. "Emily," Jake said softly, kneeling down to her level. "We're going to be all right. We're leaving, but it's for your safety. I promised I'd protect you, and I'm going to keep that promise." Emily nodded, though her face was still filled with fear and uncertainty. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she trusted Jake. She trusted him to keep her safe. "Come on," Jake said, standing up and offering his hand. Emily hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, her small fingers curling around his. Together, they followed the man out of the cabin and into the cool night air. Jake kept his head on a swivel, eyes constantly scanning for any signs of danger. The world outside felt colder than it ever had, but Jake felt a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He had Emily by his side, and that was all that mattered. He would do whatever it took to protect her, to give her the life she deserved, far from the violence and the fear that had haunted them both. The night was quiet as they walked away from the cabin, the past behind them and the future unknown. But Jake was no longer afraid. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth protecting, and as long as Emily was with him, he would keep that promise, no matter what it took.